This is a lecture on the book of Ruth, a story of grace, love, and redemption by me. My name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. A little bit of an introduction to Ruth. Authorship, we don't know who wrote it. Date of the book, it's sometime after David. David is listed as a descendant of Ruth in chapter 4, verse 17, and also verse 22. The historical setting, verse 1 puts it in the time of the judges, during the days which the judges were judging, and hence it would date to about the period of the judges, which is roughly 1350 to 1050 BC. The nature of this book is that it is a short story. Some call it a novella. But in any case, it's a charming story, a beautifully told story, and a love story. And the story's been retold many times. I found a couple of children's books that tells the story. One apparently geared towards more of an African American audience, and another one geared for more of a Caucasian audience, neither one of which reflect the way people would look in the Middle East. But in any case, Ruth is a Moabite woman who marries into the family of Abimelech and Naomi from Bethlehem in Judah. Abimelech and Naomi had fled to Moab because of a famine in Judah. But after they get there, all the men of the family die, Abimelech and also his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, leaving Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah as widows. Now you can see where they would have needed to have gone. They would have had to go north of the Dead Sea to cross through Reuben territory into the territory of Moab. Well, after the death of all the men, Naomi heads home to Bethlehem in Judah. She urges her daughters-in-law to return to their Moabite families. Orpah turns home, but Ruth refused to go home and chooses instead to go with Naomi. She puts it in these words, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." By the way, this verse is often read at weddings. A little bit ironic since it wasn't a wedding vow, but it was a daughter-in-law speaking to her mother-in-law. When Ruth and Naomi get back to Judah in chapter 2, they struggle to survive. They eke out a living by, Ruth especially, gleaning the fields. Gleaning the fields meant that you could go after they had harvested most of the crop to pick up leftovers. And this was something that was allowed to the poor according to Mosaic law. Boaz, who was a wealthy, distant relative of Naomi, encouraged Ruth to glean his field. He ordered his men to be kind to her. This in view of the sacrifices that Ruth had made to be with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi, hearing of Boaz's interests, begins to plot marriage for Ruth. She saw the hand of God in an eventual marriage for Ruth and security for both of them in all of these events. And so chapter 3, they go about trying to secure a marriage with Boaz. It was the end of the harvest season during the harvest festival. Naomi advised Ruth to find where Boaz slept on the threshing floor and uncover his feet and lie down at his feet, which is what Ruth actually does. This was in essence an offer of marriage. Though bear in mind that a man of lesser character might have taken advantage of the situation unfairly. And so she does that. Boaz wakes up to find the girl Ruth with him, and he inquires who she is. He didn't know in the dark. And then he receives this unusual proposal of marriage from Ruth that she has uncovered his feet and then also says verbally that that's what her intention is. Boaz appears to have been flattered by the offer. He apparently was quite a bit older than Ruth. But by custom, another close relative would have the right to be the kinsman redeemer, the Hebrew word is goel, who would marry her and raise up an heir for her deceased husband. In the morning, then, she went home to Naomi, and Boaz tried to squelch any nasty rumors about her spending the night with him. In chapter 4, the closer relative was approached, and although the closer relative was willing to redeem Abimelech's field, he did not want to have Ruth as a part of the bargain, since any child through her would inherit the field, and that would badly affect his current children. And so he chose not to accept that role as kinsman redeemer, and thus Boaz won the right of redemption. So Ruth ended up marrying Boaz. She bore him a child by the name of Obed. Naomi, the grandmother, was delighted because she knew that she would be taken care of in her old age. And Obed, as it turns out, was the grandfather of King David, as chapter 4:17 and verse 22 mentions. So what does this charming story have to teach us today? What's the theology of the book of Ruth? Well, one of the things it teaches us is about the grace of God. Now, a key word in the book of Ruth is the Hebrew term chesed. There's no single English word that catches the meaning, but it combines the idea of kindness and grace and covenant love and loyalty and faithfulness. And God shows his chesed in the book of Ruth. Examples of God's chesed: God's grace in providing for Ruth and Naomi. Indeed, God is the source of chesed. Naomi wishes it upon her widowed daughters. May the Lord deal kindly with you, chapter 1 and verse 8. But that deal kindly is literally do chesed. Naomi recognized that God had not, quote, withheld his kindness, Hebrew word chesed, to the family of her dead husband, chapter 2 and verse 22. When it became clear that Boaz was interested in Ruth, she saw God's grace in these unfolding events, and it turns out that she was correct. Another theme of the book of Ruth is the providence of God. Ruth happened to come upon the part of the field belonging to Boaz, chapter 2 and verse 3. But there's an irony in the statement, for it's not mere chance, but God's providential care that is involved here. In this book, God works not through overt miracles, but in subtle ways, through chance guidance, through the kindness of people. We can see God's guidance in a similar way in our own lives, if only we look. You might compare the Joseph story and also the book of Esther, which also give similar cases of God's providential care. And then there's the virtue of loyalty and kindness that human beings are to exhibit. That's our word chesed again. It can be translated kindness or loyalty. And examples of human kindness are abundant in the book of Ruth. Ruth's choice to remain with Naomi was an act of chesed, or loyalty kindness. And Ruth is commended for her chesed by Boaz a couple of different times. Boaz says, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been reported to me, and how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work." That's chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And then Boaz again says, You have shown your last kindness, and this time the word chesed is used, to be better than the first by not going after the young men, whether rich or poor. She did an act of kindness by choosing to marry in a way that would help her mother-in-law most, rather than the way that she might naturally be inclined to do. A fourth theme in Ruth is the theme of Gentiles and God. Ruth, as it turns out, is a non-Israelite. She's a Moabitess. But because she adopted the Lord as her God, as she told Ruth, "Your God will be my God," she is accepted by God and by God's people. And this is in part a fulfillment of Genesis 12 and verse 3, that in Abraham's seed all families of earth will be blessed. And she becomes a part of that blessing. Then there's an important concept of kinsman redeemer in this book. The Hebrew word is goel. It means redeemer, but it's a concept which the Old Testament also applies to God, often in the book of Isaiah, and the New Testament applies to Christ. Now, it's called a kinsman redeemer because the duty of a goel was especially to help out his relatives. So a goel might redeem a piece of property that a relative had to hawk because of debts, or to sustain him without charging interest if he had to borrow from you to survive, or to redeem the relative himself if he got so poor that he had to sell himself into slavery. You'll see this all talked about in Leviticus chapter 25. Boaz is an example of a kinsman redeemer. Now, technically, there was a law about a brother serving as a kinsman redeemer for a widow, but since he was not a brother, no law required him to do what he did. He chose to do it out of grace. And thus, Boaz is a type of Christ. Christ chose to call us to his family and to act on our behalf to redeem us from our distress. He didn't have to do that, but out of grace, he chose to do that. And then we have the messianic seed promise, the election of Christ. God chose to preserve the family of Abimelech in order that he might be in the chosen line of David, and through David in the line of Jesus the Messiah. You might notice that there were a number of women that are listed in the genealogy of Matthew 1 in the lineage of Christ, and one of those is Ruth the Moabitess. But let me mention the other three. There was Tamar, who seduced Judah, her father-in-law, by acting as a prostitute. There was Rahab, who was professionally a prostitute. There was Ruth, who was a Moabite foreigner. And there was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, with whom David committed adultery. All of them have ignoble pasts. All of them, including Ruth, were foreigners. And thus we see the mysterious workings of God in choosing such to be in Christ's lineage. So this is a lecture on the book of Ruth by me. I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle.